The Galactic Scouts, a team known throughout the galaxy for their elite status, confidently approached the lush, uncharted jungle planet on the outskirts of known space. Lieutenant Zira, a rising star among the scouts, stood at the helm of their transport ship, her eyes scanning the rugged terrain below. The mission was simple: survey the planet for resources, map its environment, and claim it for their empire. They had been sent on countless similar missions before, each one resulting in swift and successful conquests. This would be no different. As the team disembarked, their boots sank into the thick undergrowth, and the dense jungle air wrapped around them like a suffocating blanket. Their advanced tech, ranging from state-of-the-art communication systems to heat sensors, ensured they could handle any situation. The scouts, fully equipped for whatever challenge lay ahead, took a moment to survey the area, their gazes scanning the foliage with an air of indifference. They had seen it all before. Nothing could faze them. Zira, however, couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something more to this planet. Her instincts told her that the planet's jungle was hiding something. But the rest of the team remained confident, dismissing any notion of potential danger. It was just a jungle. They were here to do their job, and nothing more. The first sign of trouble came when a scout triggered an unfamiliar device, one that none of their technology had detected. The scout stumbled back, falling to the ground as a sharp, sudden snap rang out. A snare had wrapped around his leg, pulling him up off the ground. A series of automated mechanisms clicked into place, further tightening the trap. The rest of the team rushed over, their usual calm now replaced with confusion and unease. They had underestimated the planet's potential for danger, and now one of their own was hanging helplessly from the trees. Zira, her brow furrowed, took a closer look at the snare. It was made of crude materials, yet its design was intricate, neatly tied knots and perfectly balanced tension. It seemed far too sophisticated for the primitive surroundings. It didn't belong. The team's engineer, a burly man named Tarun, began to cut through the snare's mechanism, but not before he voiced the obvious concerns. "This shouldn't be here. Who would go through the trouble of setting a trap like this?" Zira's voice was steady but uncertain as she replied, "We don't know yet. But it's clearly not natural. Something, designed it." The scout, now freed, limped away from the trap, his pride more wounded than his leg. But Zira couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a coincidence. She watched as the rest of the team worked quickly to scan the area for other potential threats. The jungle felt alive, the silence ominous. Zira couldn't help but think that whoever, or whatever, was behind these traps was watching them. Despite their technology, the scouts found no sign of any other traps or hidden forces. The jungle's dense foliage and the planet's unfamiliar atmosphere hampered their sensor readings. The scouting party continued on, determined to complete their mission. But the disquiet remained, gnawing at Zira. The planet wasn't just another uninhabited world, it was a place where someone had gone to great lengths to hide. The tension escalated when the second trap was triggered. A scout was dragged beneath the dense underbrush by a thick coil of vines that shot from the earth, wrapping him tightly and pulling him into the ground. His screams echoed through the trees. The team, startled by the sudden attack, scrambled to pull him free, but by the time they did, his leg was shattered, and he was barely conscious. This wasn't a simple snare anymore. This was something far more deadly. Zira's mind raced. The snare had been complex, but this was an entire system. It was well thought out, precise, and tailored for something far more dangerous than they had expected. They had assumed the traps were a fluke, a minor inconvenience, but they were wrong. Someone, had planned all of this with incredible foresight. "We need to get to the bottom of this," Zira said, her voice firm. She knew the others were feeling the weight of the situation, their arrogance quickly fading as the mystery unfolded before them. The mission had shifted from a routine survey to something far more dangerous, and the scouts were beginning to realize they had underestimated the planet, and the unseen threat that lurked within it. Alex Cade, who had long since abandoned the world of empires and militaristic conquest, had been observing them from a distance. Hidden within his carefully constructed underground bunker, he watched the scouts' movements on his surveillance screens. For years, he had lived in isolation, his only company the hum of his carefully planned defense systems. His life had been defined by precision and control, elements he had mastered in his days as a military engineer. And now, his creation, his sanctuary, was under threat. Alex had never expected this, an intrusion by galactic forces. But the scouts were here now, and they were not to be taken lightly. His heart was hardened against humanity, against everything they had done to the galaxy. He had seen the worst of human nature and built his traps not just to protect himself, but to keep the world at bay. His system, complex and layered, would ensure that no one, no matter how advanced, would disturb his peace. He watched as the scouts fumbled with the traps, their technology faltering in the face of his ingenuity. Alex could hear their frustration, their confusion. They were out of their element, just as he had planned. As the scouts continued to fight against the deadly devices he had set, Alex felt a strange satisfaction. He was in control. They were the intruders, and now they were paying the price. Still, one part of him wondered, did they deserve this? Zira, in particular, intrigued him. There was something different about her. She was more than just a soldier, more than just a cog in a machine. Alex had no illusions about human beings, but Zira's calm determination and intellect suggested a more thoughtful, calculated approach. He could feel her presence, feel her mind working as she pieced together the clues that had been left in the jungle. But it didn't matter. She was still part of the intruding force, and he would have to deal with her, just like the others. Zira's mind raced as she moved through the jungle, piecing together the puzzle. She had come to a conclusion: these traps weren't designed to kill. They were meant to capture, to hold. Whoever had set them up was far from a typical predator. This wasn't about dominance. This wasn't about a quick kill. There was a deliberate intent behind these traps, and Zira knew it was time to discover who was responsible. But as she looked up at the dense foliage above, she could feel the eyes of her enemy watching her every move. The hunt had only just begun. The tension among the scouts was palpable. With each passing minute, the mission that had started as a simple exploration was descending into chaos. They were no longer just surveying the planet's surface. They were fighting for their lives. The traps, seemingly innocuous at first, were proving to be a far more formidable force than any of them had anticipated. Each new device was an invention of brutality, designed with precision to incapacitate, not kill. But the scouts were no less vulnerable because of it. Zira's mind raced as she pieced together the patterns of the traps. It was clear now, these were not random. Someone had carefully studied the landscape, calculated every angle, and built a complex network of snares and mechanisms. There was an artistry to the designs, a sophistication that suggested the creator was not a simple hunter, but something more calculated. These traps were not just designed to kill, they were meant to control, to subdue, and to provoke. The scouts' technology, which had always given them the upper hand in previous missions, was failing them. Their heat sensors couldn't detect the traps. Their scanners couldn't differentiate between the natural environment and the man-made devices hidden within. What was meant to be a controlled, easy mission was turning into a nightmare. Zira took a step back, her hands resting on her hips as she surveyed the damage. 2 more scouts had fallen victim to the traps, one knocked unconscious and the other left with a deep gash on his arm. As the engineer tried to assess their gear and make repairs, Zira began to piece together the nature of their enemy. These traps were too intricate, too deliberate, to be the work of any wild animal. No, this was a human, a person who had not only survived here but thrived in isolation, honing their craft over years, perhaps decades. She had noticed the strange, calculated design of the snares earlier, but now, the realization struck her fully. These traps were designed not for simple ambushes, but to incapacitate and disorient. There was no instinctual savagery at play here. It was all methodical and precise. Whoever had set them was an expert, a master of control. And in that moment Zira knew that they were not dealing with some mindless predator. They were dealing with a human engineer, a specialist. "Lieutenant, we need to reconsider our approach," one of the scouts said, his voice strained. We're getting picked off one by one. Our tech's not working, and we're not making any progress. Maybe we should fall back, call for backup. Zira's gaze hardened. The idea of retreat was not one she was willing to entertain. She had a duty to her team, and backing down wasn't an option. No. We push forward, she said firmly, trying to keep the uncertainty from her voice. There's something here we're missing, and I'm not leaving until we figure it out. The scouts exchanged uncertain glances, but Zira's resolve was clear. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the cusp of something bigger, something that required all of their focus. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about understanding their enemy. And from what she had seen so far, this was no ordinary predator. The group pressed on, cautiously maneuvering through the thick underbrush, their weapons drawn, every sense heightened. But Zira couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The jungle was silent, almost unnervingly so. The only sounds were the occasional snap of a branch, or the rustling of leaves in the wind. But those were sounds they were familiar with. The silence of the traps, however, was different. It was oppressive. As they moved forward, Zira's mind kept returning to the same thought. Why hadn't the traps been more lethal? They had seen enough deadly weapons in their time, explosive devices, energy blasts, and even biological weapons, but these traps weren't designed for death. They were designed for something else. What did that something else mean? Hours passed with no further incidents, but Zira could tell that the team was on edge. The scouts, usually composed and confident, were beginning to crack under the strain of the unknown. They had lost more than just equipment and time, they had lost their sense of control. The more they tried to press forward, the more they were forced to reckon with the jungle's defenses. When Zira finally spoke again, her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of her newfound realization. The traps, they're designed to capture, not to kill, she said, her tone sharp and decisive. We're not up against a monster or an alien force. This is a person, someone who knows what they're doing. They've thought this through. The scouts exchanged confused looks. But why would they attack us like this? One asked, his voice skeptical. We're just here to map the planet. Zira shook her head, her expression hardening. Maybe they didn't know that. Maybe they thought we were invaders. Maybe they thought we were a threat. It was then that a voice, distant but unmistakably human, crackled through the comms. I see you're still alive. Remarkable. The voice was calm, even amused, as though it was addressing an interesting puzzle rather than an armed threat. I must admit, I didn't expect you to last this long. Zira froze, her heart racing. The voice was clear now, this was the person behind the traps. Whoever they were, they had been watching them all along. And worse, they had been toying with them. Who are you? Zira demanded, her tone sharp. What do you want from us? There was a brief pause, as though the voice on the other end was considering her words. I want nothing from you, the voice replied coolly. You're the ones who invaded my home. I'm simply defending myself. Zira's mind churned with this new information. This wasn't just a random act of violence or defense. This was a deliberate confrontation. They had triggered something far more complex than a simple encounter. They had walked into the domain of someone who had built their entire existence around survival, someone who knew exactly how to manipulate every inch of this land to their advantage. As Zira's gaze flicked to her team, the weight of the situation finally settled. They weren't here to subdue a rogue species or conquer a new world. They were dealing with someone who had been living alone in this jungle, honing their craft and mastering their environment. This was a trap specialist, someone who had made survival an art form, and they were now facing off against the scouts who had assumed their technology and power made them invincible. And now, it seemed, it was Zira's turn to find a way out. With the stakes higher than ever, she knew that the only way to survive wasn't just by relying on the team's strength, it was by understanding the mind of the person who had set these traps. The game had changed. Now Zira had to outwit a master. The sudden communication from the stranger, whoever they were, lingered in Zira's mind as the scouts regrouped, their bodies and minds worn thin by the relentless traps. She had been so certain of their strength, their technological superiority, but now it was clear that this planet wasn't just another target to be claimed. It was a well-guarded mystery, a test that none of them were prepared for. Zira's heart pounded as she surveyed the group. The earlier cocky confidence had completely dissipated. They were no longer soldiers on a routine mission. They were survivors, and the jungle, with its hidden dangers, was now a battleground. The mysterious voice on the comms had changed everything. This was no animal. It was a person, someone who had been living in isolation for so long that they had become an expert in the art of defense. Someone who had crafted traps that could disarm even the most sophisticated technology the scouts had. And now, they were being manipulated, forced into a dangerous game that seemed to have no rules. Zira turned to the team, her voice steady but filled with urgency. We need to approach this differently. We're not dealing with wild animals, or even the usual hostile species. This is a person, a strategist. We need to stop reacting and start thinking. The engineer, Tarun, nodded in agreement, his face pale from exhaustion. I don't care what we're up against. We need to find this person, disable the traps, and secure a way off this planet. This whole mission's gone sideways, Zira. I know, she replied, her tone softening for a moment. But we're still in this. We need to figure out who's behind these traps and what their motive is. The scouts began to set up a perimeter, their movements deliberate but cautious. Zira, however, kept thinking about the voice they had heard. It had been calm, almost detached. The person wasn't just defending themselves. They were playing a game. They had led the scouts into a maze, and now, Zira realized, they were being forced to find the way out. The mystery deepened with every step they took. Zira felt a chill run down her spine when she realized that their pursuer was likely watching them at every moment. Every shadow in the trees, every rustle of leaves could have been a signal from the unseen figure who was orchestrating this entire scenario. They weren't just walking through a jungle, they were trapped, the predator's eyes always on them. It was then that Zira had an idea. The traps, as deadly and sophisticated as they were, followed a pattern. They were designed to capture and confuse, not necessarily to kill. Whoever had set them wasn't interested in their deaths. They were testing them, toying with them. This wasn't just about survival. It was about proving something. But what? Zira turned to her team. I think we've been looking at this all wrong. These traps aren't meant to kill us, they're meant to test us. They want to see how we react. They want to know how we think. The scouts exchanged puzzled glances, but Zira's words seemed to spark something in them. For the first time since the traps had started, they began to shift their approach. Instead of focusing on getting out alive, they focused on understanding the mind behind the traps. The more they thought about it, the more it became clear, they weren't dealing with an animal or an alien species. This was a person who had taken the time to learn everything about the land, about them. I agree, said Zara, the scout leader who had been a quiet presence up until now. But we don't have time for philosophical debates. We need to neutralize the threat before it neutralizes us. Neutralizing the threat means figuring out who they are, what they want, and how we can get them to stop. Zira responded. We don't have the advantage here. They've already outsmarted us once. It's time to learn their game and turn it back on them. The team reluctantly agreed, and for the first time in hours, they worked in unison, moving quietly and cautiously through the dense underbrush. Zira's mind raced as she pieced together the clues. Whoever this person was, they had been living here for a long time. The traps were too intricate, the designs too well thought out, to be the work of a mere novice. The engineer, Tarun, had noticed something similar when inspecting the traps. They were sophisticated and meant to disorient, confuse, and trap, not to kill outright. The person behind them wasn't interested in a quick kill. They wanted to keep their prey alive, to prolong the hunt. The question remained, why? Zira's instincts told her that the answer lay not in the traps themselves, but in their creator. This wasn't some aimless survivalist. This was someone who had been through something, someone who had a reason for creating a sanctuary of death. She thought back to the moment when the voice had spoken through the comms. The calm, almost detached tone. There had been no fear, no malice, just a simple statement of fact. Whoever this person was, they had become something more than human. They had become an entity in the jungle itself, a part of its pulse, its rhythm. And now, they were testing the scouts. "We need to find their base," Zira said, a new determination settling into her bones. "They're controlling this entire environment. We need to understand it before they understand us completely." The team moved forward, driven now by the need to solve the puzzle. Each trap they encountered was more complicated than the last. The predator, if that's even what it was, had thought of everything. Zira's eyes narrowed as she realized that they were being pushed towards something. The traps were forcing them to move in a specific direction. Slowly it dawned on her, this was a game, and they were the pieces being moved across a board. "Do you hear that?" one of the scouts whispered, his voice urgent. Zira paused, straining to hear. There, in the distance, the faintest hum of machinery. The unmistakable sound of a trap being reset. "They're close," Zira muttered. "They're watching." The scouts moved faster, adrenaline kicking in. The jungle, once beautiful and untamed, now felt like a labyrinth. Every turn could lead them deeper into the traps, or toward the person who had been orchestrating the entire ordeal. But Zira couldn't afford to lose focus. She had to think like the creator of these traps. She had to put herself in their shoes and anticipate the next move. As they neared the source of the hum, Zira noticed something. A hidden path, barely visible, winding through the dense foliage. It was barely a trail, but it was unmistakable. This was it, the path that would lead them to the person behind the traps. The jungle had been steering them toward it the whole time. She signaled to her team to follow her. The closer they got, the more the tension mounted. This was it. They were going to face their enemy. And when they did, Zira was determined to find out why this person had chosen to live like this. What had driven them to this point? Was it simply survival, or something deeper? What was their endgame? As the scouts reached the clearing where the hum was the loudest, they prepared themselves for the final confrontation. Zira steeled herself. Whatever happened next, she would make sure they wouldn't be just another group of invaders. Their story was far from over. Zira's heart raced as she led the scouts toward the clearing. The weight of their predicament pressed heavily on her shoulders. The jungle was no longer a vast, unknown wilderness. It had become a carefully crafted maze, each turn leading them deeper into the heart of a conflict that neither side had expected. But now, they were closing in on their elusive enemy. Whoever this person was, they were about to face the scouts head-on. The hum of machinery grew louder as they moved closer. Zira knew that they were on the brink of something crucial. Every instinct told her they had reached the right place, but doubt gnawed at the edges of her thoughts. What would they find? Was it just another trap, another layer to this twisted game? Or would they finally confront the person who had been orchestrating their every move? The jungle, once serene, now felt alive with anticipation. The birds and insects had gone silent, as though holding their breath in unison. Zira and her team advanced cautiously, each step measured. Their weapons were ready, but there was no telling what kind of battle lay ahead. The traps they had encountered had been non-lethal, meant to capture and confuse rather than kill. But they weren't sure if the same logic would apply to their next confrontation. If it was indeed the person who had been controlling the jungle, then they had to be ready for anything. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Zira finally allowed herself a moment to stop and take in the surroundings. The dense foliage parted just enough to reveal a small, fortified structure built into the side of a cliff. It wasn't large, but it was fortified in a way that suggested the person inside knew exactly what they were doing. It was an isolated stronghold, hidden from any eyes that might search for it. Zira's gaze swept across the area, noting the strategic placement of traps that had been carefully designed to funnel anyone approaching into a vulnerable position. This was no ordinary hideout, it was a carefully planned fortress. Whoever had designed this place wasn't just a survivalist. They were a strategist, someone who understood the land better than anyone else. Zira's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of information she had gathered. This was a person who had been living in isolation for years, perfecting their skills and using the planet's resources to their advantage. And now, they were forcing the scouts into a situation where they had no choice but to confront them. "We're close," Zira whispered to the team. "Stay alert." The scouts tightened their grip on their weapons, their faces grim. They were ready for whatever lay ahead, but there was still an undercurrent of uncertainty. Despite the bravado they had displayed earlier, they knew they were in uncharted territory. They had underestimated this person, and they couldn't afford to make the same mistake again. Zira motioned for the team to spread out, ensuring that they could cover as much ground as possible without making themselves an easy target. The structure in front of them seemed quiet, almost abandoned. But Zira knew better than to assume anything. The traps had always been hidden, waiting to strike when least expected. It was possible that the creator of these traps was observing them right now, watching their every move. The tension in the air was thick as they moved closer to the entrance of the fortress. Zira's eyes flicked around the perimeter, noting the various tripwires and pressure plates that had been carefully concealed within the undergrowth. The creator of these traps was a master of stealth and deception. They had anticipated every possible move the scouts might make and had designed the environment to keep them on edge. Zira took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She knew that they were about to face their enemy, not just as soldiers, but as human beings. There were no more distractions. This was the moment of truth. They had reached the heart of the puzzle, and now they had to solve it. As they reached the doorway, Zira paused, signaling for the team to hold their position. Something didn't feel right. The structure seemed too quiet, too still. It was almost as if they were walking into a trap within a trap. Zira's instincts told her that the final test was about to begin. The moment she stepped forward, a series of mechanisms inside the structure clicked into motion. The ground beneath her feet shifted, and before she could react, the entrance to the fortress slammed shut. Panic surged through her as the scouts were separated, trapped inside a carefully designed cage. The walls of the structure shifted, and Zira realized with dawning horror that they were now inside a giant, enclosed space, like a massive arena. A voice crackled through the comms again, its tone mocking and almost amused. "I must admit, I wasn't expecting such persistence. You've done well to get this far. But you've missed the point, haven't you?" Zira's blood ran cold as she recognized the voice. The person behind the traps, the one who had orchestrated their every move. "Who are you?" Zira demanded, her voice steady despite the rising panic. There was a pause, and then the voice responded with a cold, detached amusement. "Who am I? That's an interesting question. But you're not here to know my name. You're here because you couldn't resist the challenge. You thought you were the hunters, but you were never the ones in control." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Zira felt a mix of frustration and realization wash over her. This wasn't just a test of survival. It was a test of their arrogance, their belief that they could conquer anything. And now, they were the ones being toyed with. They were not in control. They had never been in control. The walls around them hummed to life, and Zira's heart skipped a beat as she realized what was happening. The arena they had been trapped in was now shifting, closing in on them. The walls began to narrow, pushing them toward the center of the space. The creator of the traps was manipulating them, guiding them toward a confrontation that Zira wasn't sure they could survive. "Think carefully," the voice continued, its tone chilling. "You wanted to claim this planet, but in doing so, you've become part of the game. The question now is, can you escape? Or will you become another lesson in survival?" Zira's mind raced as she processed the words. There was no way out without facing the creator of the traps. The arena was designed to force them into a confrontation, and there was no escaping it. But the stakes were higher than ever. If they failed, they wouldn't just be defeated, they would be part of the lesson. They would be an example for whoever came after them, another failure in a world where only the strongest survived. The scouts gathered in the center of the arena, their backs to one another as they prepared for the final confrontation. The walls continued to close in, but Zira knew that this was it. the moment where they had to confront the creator of the traps. There was no turning back now. She had come this far, and she would not fail. The time for hesitation was over. They would face the person who had set these traps, and they would either survive or become another part of the jungle's dark history. The battle ahead would be their greatest challenge, and Zira had no illusions about what it would cost. But she had come to understand something crucial. This was no longer just a mission. It was about survival, about proving that they could adapt, that they could think beyond their technology and their training. It was about showing the creator of these traps that humanity was more than just an invading force. They were capable of much more. And now, it was time to prove it.